During the Golden Age, Hollywood didn't just produce movies, it produced illusions. And one of the most carefully protected illusions was the image of the dominant leading man, tall, imposing, born to stand above everyone else. Because of that illusion, the leading man was never allowed to be short. Audiences were trained to believe that Hollywood legends all possessed perfect physiques. But behind the lights, the truth was completely different. Some stars barely stood over 5 feet tall. Some powerhouse icons spent their entire careers wearing lifts. Some film sets were forced to dig trenches, build raised platforms, tilt camera angles, and even write contract clauses, all to conceal a few centimeters that Hollywood considered fatal. Instead of fixing the man, they fixed the space. They fixed the frame. And they fixed the truth. These are the 9 Golden Age stars with the most modest height. Behind their smaller frames were ambitions to appear larger than life, a fear of being pushed aside, desperate acts of resistance, and tragedies that followed them for an entire lifetime. And the first name we begin with is the shortest of them all, yet also the one who forced Hollywood into silence for decades. Before we dive into the first story, hit like and leave a comment, because what's about to be revealed is something Hollywood never wanted you to hear. 1. Charlie Chaplin, the short clown and the shadow Hollywood refused to name. When people talk about Charlie Chaplin, they usually think of a genius who made the world laugh and then cry using nothing but a crooked walk and a bowler hat. But there's one detail rarely said out loud: Chaplin stood around 5 feet. In the early 20th century, that was the kind of height that branded a man as not big enough, especially in a Hollywood that was busy redefining the leading man as tall, dominating, and built to conquer the frame. Hollywood never called Chaplin short. Instead, it chose something more sophisticated. It locked him into an image where height was no longer a problem, because he was never treated as an ordinary man. From The Kid 1921 to City Lights 1931, Chaplin is rarely placed beside full-grown, physically imposing male characters in the same static shot. That wasn't accidental. In the memoirs of cinematographer Raleigh Totherow, Chaplin's longtime collaborator, there's mention of an unspoken rule on set: avoid letting the audience compare Chaplin directly with other men, because that comparison, once it happened, would expose a truth Hollywood refused to face. That is why the tramp costume wasn't just artistic genius. It was a calculated disguise. The baggy pants distort proportions and make the legs look shorter. The tight jacket compresses the upper body. The small hat throws off the head-to-torso ratio. Together, it turns Chaplin into something almost asexual, almost powerless, more like a misplaced creature than a man. The audience was allowed to love him and pity him, but they didn't have to see him as a rival or as someone standing on equal ground within the hierarchy of masculinity. The real problem began when Chaplin no longer wanted to stay inside that cage. In 1947, Monsieur Verdoux premiered in New York. This time, Chaplin wasn't playing a harmless drifter. He played a cold, educated man who murders women for money and justifies it with razor-sharp social arguments. The backlash was immediate. The New York Times wrote that Chaplin was no longer charming when he speaks like a man with power. Another critic sneered, "There's something wrong with Chaplin standing on a moral podium." No one mentioned height, but the message was obvious. He was saying things Hollywood wasn't used to hearing from someone like him. At the same time, Chaplin's private life was dragged into headlines at breakneck speed: marriages to very young girls, paternity and support disputes, whispers of control and dependency. In 1943, the Joan Barry case in Santa Monica became the flashpoint. The Los Angeles Examiner ran a vicious headline: "The Little Tramp in Big Trouble." For the first time, the nickname that once brought global affection was used as a weapon. In a courtroom, no camera angles, no studio lighting, Chaplin's smaller frame became brutally exposed. And with it came the question Hollywood had avoided for years: how does a man like this hold power at all? The rumors didn't stop there. By the late 1940s, the FBI had compiled a surveillance file on Chaplin. A declassified report in 1952 listed multiple relationships with young women, many under 20. Agents tracked him from Los Angeles to London. One line in the report reads coldly, "Chaplin exploits his fame to access immature women." When the kind clown image could no longer shield him, the system began to withdraw its protection. So, when Chaplin left the U.S. in September 1952 aboard the Queen Elizabeth to premiere Limelight in London, he didn't realize he would never return. Before the ship even reached Europe, the U.S. government announced it was revoking his re-entry permit. No trial, no formal conviction, just an administrative decision. Hollywood didn't need to condemn Chaplin, it only needed to remove him from the frame of power. Chaplin spent the rest of his life in Switzerland, honored from a distance, called a legend, but never allowed back into the center. Charlie Chaplin's tragedy wasn't that he was short. It was this: Hollywood only accepted him when he was small, harmless, and never demanded to be seen as a fully grown man with real authority. The moment he stepped outside that image, the entire system slammed the door shut. And that's how the first Golden Age legend was locked away, not by height, but by Hollywood's fear. But if Charlie Chaplin was trapped inside the small man image Hollywood designed to keep him harmless, the next man chose a different strategy: Frank Sinatra, someone who understood perfectly that in Hollywood, the moment people look down on you, your power collapses before the truth even has time to surface. 2. Frank Sinatra. Elevator shoes, camera angles, and the terror of being looked down on. Frank Sinatra didn't fear criticism. He feared the moment the audience realized the boss in front of them wasn't tall enough to stand above anyone. If Chaplin was boxed in to keep him harmless, Sinatra entered the Golden Age with a different obsession. Under no circumstances could he allow anyone to look down on him. Not even physically. Not even for a second. Sinatra stood around 5'7", 1.70 meters a height, that wouldn't stand out in everyday life, but became a serious problem in 1940s, 1950s Hollywood, where the unwritten leading man standard was closer to 6 feet, 1.83, broad shoulders, imposing posture, and big enough to dominate the frame. For Sinatra, height wasn't a body measurement, it was a direct threat to the masculine power image he was rebuilding from the ashes of a once-collapsed singing career. A decisive turning point came in 1953 on the set of From Here to Eternity, filmed in Hawaii and Los Angeles, where Sinatra played Private Angelo Maggio, opposite Burt Lancaster, nearly 6 feet tall, physically solid, and unmistakably military in presence. According to behind-the-scenes records from Columbia Pictures and later recollections from assistant camera crew, Sinatra was often positioned one step higher than Lancaster in key dialogue scenes, or shot from a slightly lower angle to create the visual impression that they were equal in dominance. In Maggio's confrontational scene with Lancaster's character, the camera dips just enough for Sinatra's face to take visual control, an intentional choice in a film measured down to centimeters of composition. After the film's massive success, Hollywood press started noticing how Sinatra was always placed correctly. Magazines like Photoplay and Variety never named the issue directly, but repeatedly described Sinatra as being shot very advantageously, a polite way of saying his image was carefully engineered. Later, backstage photographers confirmed that throughout most performances and shoots in the 1950s, Sinatra wore elevator shoes lifts of about 2 to 3 centimeters to narrow the height gap between him and the men around him. Sinatra's obsession kept showing during the filming of The Man with the Golden Arm in 1955, shot in Chicago, under director Otto Preminger, someone famous for not bending easily to actors. Yet according to accounts recorded in Preminger Anatomy of a Filmmaker, Sinatra repeatedly asked for blocking adjustments in multiple scenes, so he wouldn't be left standing next to taller male actors in the same static frame for too long. And when that couldn't be avoided, the camera would be kept in motion, or Sinatra would be positioned slightly higher, even if it was only by a single small step. None of these changes appeared in official paperwork, but they became an unwritten routine on set. Off-camera, Sinatra reacted aggressively to any hint about his appearance. In 1954, the New York Daily News ran a mocking item about Sinatra's volatile temperament laced with half-hidden jokes about his build. Within days, the story spread through Hollywood bars. That same year, Sinatra got into a fight at Romanoff's in Beverly Hills after hearing a comment he considered insulting witnesses. later said that if someone even suggested he wasn't big enough, Sinatra's rage could explode instantly. But hiding his height wasn't merely personal insecurity, it was tied directly to the power image Sinatra was building in entertainment and in the shadow power world of Las Vegas. During the Rat Pack era, Sinatra wasn't just a performer. He was the center of a web involving casino owners and mafia-connected circles, where being looked down on literally or symbolically meant losing status. A former Sands casino manager once told Time that Sinatra always had to be the tallest man in the room, one way or another, a line that reveals the psychology driving nearly everything he did. That need bled into a private life full of fractures and violence, broken marriages, allegations of assault, and bursts of uncontrolled anger, all rooted in maintaining an unbossable image that could never appear weak. And as Sinatra aged, his greatest fear began to take shape because elevator shoes couldn't hide a slowing walk, and camera angles couldn't erase exhaustion from his face. The power image he spent decades constructing became a cage that wouldn't allow him to grow old like a normal man. Frank Sinatra's tragedy wasn't that he was only 5'7". It was that his entire fame and authority were built on never being allowed to look small, even for a single moment, forcing him to fight his own body and time for the rest of his life. But that obsession didn't belong to Sinatra alone. The next Golden Age man went even further, forced to become a warrior, a conqueror, an on-screen hero, even though his body never matched the standard. That story belongs to Kirk Douglas. 3. Kirk Douglas, the undersized warrior and a lifelong height complex. In the summer of 1960, the Spartacus set at Universal Studios blazed like a real battlefield. More than 300 extras in Roman armor stood under the California sun shields, pressed to shields, spears held upright. Stanley Kubrick kept yelling "cut" with visible irritation, not because of acting, not because of lighting. The problem sat dead center in the frame. Kirk Douglas playing the rebel leader looked too small among his own army. Douglas stood around 5'8", 1.73 meter. Perfectly normal in America, but in 1950s, 1960s Hollywood, especially in epic films, the leading man standard was almost always 6 feet and above. A gladiator had to be tall, big, and physically dominate the space. Douglas wasn't, and Kubrick understood that if the camera exposed it, the entire Spartacus myth would collapse right there on set. According to a lighting technician quoted later in the Los Angeles Times, Kubrick had the ground dug out where the extras stood while Douglas was placed on a higher stone step. Then the lens was dropped low to lift Douglas's body through perspective. The camera avoided full-body angles and leaned hard into close-ups, the face, the eyes, the jaw clenched with rage. The technician reportedly mocked it with one line. The whole crew had to bend down just so one man could look taller. Those tricks weren't isolated, they became habit. In scenes where Douglas delivered speeches to crowds of slaves, the frame was always cut carefully, so no one taller appeared too clearly above him. Kubrick, famously cold, accepted any measure as long as Spartacus wouldn't become a leader, swallowed by his own army. The press sensed the weakness fast. New York Daily News threw a punchline straight at him, short for a gladiator. The Chicago Tribune went sharper, writing that Douglas looks like he's staring up at his own troops. Those lines spread across Hollywood, and people close to Douglas later said they hit his deepest insecurity. On set, Douglas grew more aggressive and controlling. He was known for blowing up when placed beside taller male actors, and especially when he felt visually blocked in the frame. That sensitivity appeared early. During a poster shoot for Champion 1949, a photographer casually suggested using a wooden box so Douglas could look taller than a co-star. According to The Hollywood Reporter, Douglas slammed his gloves to the floor, snarled, "You think I'm a joke," and walked out, forcing the shoot to be canceled. Away from the lights, the obsession spilled into a chaotic private life. Douglas gained a reputation as an infamous womanizer, with tabloids listing hundreds of affairs over decades. But behind the bragging were darker rumors, especially the story tied to Natalie Wood, an assault allegation never taken to court, yet never disappearing either. Those whispers clung to Douglas like a shadow, reflecting a need for control that reached beyond the screen. And in the middle of a cracked personal image, Douglas did something that made Hollywood both respect and fear him. While producing Spartacus, he openly hired Dalton Trumbo, still blacklisted by HUAC, and insisted on putting Trumbo's real name on screen, despite studio pressure. It was a direct challenge to the blacklist system. The cost was a quiet, unofficial blacklist in return. No documents, no announcements, just doors closing silently. The New York Times wrote a line loaded with meaning. A small warrior challenges a large system. It sounded like praise, but it also admitted the truth. Douglas always had to fight twice as hard on screen and off to make up for what Hollywood considered a deficiency. In 1996, when Kirk Douglas stepped on stage to receive an honorary Oscar, the entire room rose in applause. Roger Ebert wrote the next day, he wasn't taller than his colleagues, but that night Douglas was the greatest man in Hollywood. It reads like a beautiful ending, yet it can't erase the fact that Douglas's career was built on hiding the feeling of not being enough through camera angles, through rage, through power, and through a private life full of shadows. And if Kirk Douglas needed stone steps and camera lenses to look like a warrior, the next Golden Age star went even further. He didn't just cheat the image, he cheated directly beneath his own feet. That name was Humphrey Bogart. 4. Sammy Davis Jr., the man Hollywood didn't know where to hide. If Golden Age Hollywood was a machine built to hide male stars' flaws, Sammy Davis Jr. was the case that made the machine fail completely. Not because he lacked talent, but because no camera angle, elevator shoe, or contract clause could conceal one blunt fact: Sammy Davis Jr. was only 5'3", 1.60 meter, and he appeared mainly on live stages front-facing where there was no frame to manipulate. In the 1950s, when Las Vegas became America's entertainment capital, Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the hottest names in the business. But on a stage where lights hit the performer's body head-on, every trick becomes useless. Sammy couldn't stand one step higher than the audience. He couldn't demand a low camera angle. He couldn't crop the shot. He stood there, short black, missing an eye after a car accident in 1954, and completely exposed under the crowd's gaze. Hollywood didn't know what to do with him, and when they couldn't hide him, they chose another method. They made him hide himself with laughter. During shows at the Sands Hotel and major Las Vegas casinos in the late 1950s, Sammy often mocked his own height at the very start. He'd say things like, "Don't worry, I'm so short that if the show is bad, you won't have to look at me for long." A Variety journalist who followed the Rat Pack tour later said it wasn't confidence, it was survival. If Sammy didn't say it first, the audience would say it for him. The bitter part was that Sammy was never protected the way Sinatra was. When standing with the Rat Pack on stage or in promo photos, Sammy was often pushed to the edge of the frame, or locked into the clown role, the troublemaker, the comic relief, the background that made Sinatra and Dean Martin look even cooler. A photographer once said bluntly in Life magazine, Sammy always had to stand where he wouldn't make anyone look shorter. That discrimination wasn't just visual, it was real. In everyday life, Sammy was repeatedly banned from staying overnight in the very hotels where he performed simply because he was black. In 1959, after a sold-out night at the Sands, Sammy was forced to leave and find another place to sleep, while Sinatra and the Rat Pack walked straight up to their luxury suites. Jet magazine exposed the story, and it sparked outrage, but the system faced no consequences. Sammy still had to return to the stage the next night, smiling, dancing, and joking as if nothing happened. Being forced to play the punching bag wore him down from the inside. By the early 1960s, Sammy struggled with alcohol and drug addiction, long stretches of depression, and the feeling of being trapped in a role he could never escape. In a rare interview with Playboy, Sammy admitted, "If I stop joking about myself, they won't know where to put me." That was Sammy Davis Jr.'s real tragedy. Hollywood didn't hide his height, not because it was honest, but because he wasn't important enough to be hidden. Instead of digging trenches or building platforms, they left him exposed, then demanded he turn himself into a joke to soothe the audience's discomfort when they saw a man who didn't fit the mold. Sammy survived, became famous, became rich. But the price was a twisted inner life. He was never allowed to be serious for long, never allowed to be visibly weak, and certainly never allowed to demand visual power the way taller men beside him could. If Sammy Davis Jr. was the man Hollywood didn't bother hiding, the next man was the opposite, a star so short that Hollywood was forced to dig the ground itself to conceal him. And that name was Alan Ladd. 5. Alan Ladd, the man Hollywood literally dug trenches for. Hollywood hid many stars' height, but with Alan Ladd the cover-up wasn't a metaphor. It existed under actors' feet in dugout earth-raised wooden floors and contract clauses no one ever read aloud. Alan Ladd stood around 5'5", 1.6 feet. In 1940s, 1950s, Hollywood that could kill a leading man's career. But Ladd had what studios craved, a cold face, quiet eyes, and the aura of a silent hero. The problem was simple. If audiences realized he was shorter than the man he faced, the entire image would collapse. That became brutally clear during the filming of Shane 1953, the classic Western directed by George Stevens. On screen, Ladd's Shane had to stand toe-to-toe with Van Heflin, a man nearly 6 feet tall, 1.83 stars. On set, the height gap destroyed the illusion of a dangerous gunslinger. According to a set designer's memoir, Stevens made a blunt decision: dig a trench under the spot where Van Heflin stood, so Heflin would appear shorter than Ladd in confrontational scenes. The camera was fixed, the lighting was measured, and every movement had to follow pre-marked positions. One crew member later said, "We weren't filming. We were protecting an image." The trick didn't stop with Shane. In 1957, when Ladd starred opposite Sophia Loren in Boy on a Dolphin, the problem became even more awkward. Loren stood around 5'8", 1.73 tall and powerfully present. To keep Ladd from being visually swallowed, the production built a special raised wooden walkway just for Ladd, while Loren was staged lower, sometimes literally in water. Some behind-the-scenes photos captured the strange setup, but they quickly disappeared from promotional materials. These measures weren't improvisations, they were institutionalized. Paramount reportedly included clauses in Ladd's contracts about female co-stars' height, requiring them to be under a certain threshold or accept technical workarounds. Ladd was also issued elevator shoes regularly paid for by the studio and logged under wardrobe to avoid attention. No one named the truth, but everyone in the system knew exactly what they were hiding. The cost was Ladd's personal life collapsing. Unlike the calm hero he played, he suffered severe alcoholism and chronic depression. People close to him said he lived with constant fear that one wrong frame and everything ends. And when his career slowed, the carefully built image didn't allow him to age, weaken, or transition into different roles. In 1964, Alan Ladd died at 50, officially from a lethal mix of pills and alcohol. Hollywood mourned him and called him an icon, yet no one mentioned what had been eating him alive, the truth he was never allowed to say out loud. Alan Ladd's tragedy wasn't that he was 5'5". It was that his career was built on a lie that had to be buried in the ground, literally. Hollywood dug trenches, built platforms, wrote contracts, and paid money to keep that image alive. But when the lights went out, no technique could save a man who had been bent out of shape for too long. And if Alan Ladd was the man the system quietly fixed, the next man chose a different weapon entirely, an energy so explosive that no one dared focus on his height at all. That man was James Cagney. 6. James Cagney, a small body and a rage ready to detonate. In the summer of 1931, when The Public Enemy premiered at the Strand Theater in New York, the audience jolted upright in stunned disbelief. On screen, James Cagney smashed a grapefruit into Mae Clarke's face, no hesitation, no warning. Cagney stood around 5'5", compact, almost boyish, next to taller male actors like a school kid lost in an adult world. Yet every step, every clenched jaw, every rapid-fire line made the air in the theater feel heavier. Critic Mordaunt Hall wrote in the New York Times, "Cagney explodes like a spring compressed for too long, despite his small build." Warner Brothers understood this contradiction better than anyone. In promotional files, the studio inflated Cagney's height to 5'9", and posters were shot from low angles, placing him on steps or tight against dark walls to cheat proportions. But visual tricks couldn't hide the truth forever. In 1934, during a variety photo shoot, Cagney stood among the cast and appeared a full head shorter. An editor reportedly muttered, "This is the gangster boss. He looks like a kid in a suit." Within weeks, rumors about Cagney's real height spread across Burbank. The short label clung to him like a splinter he could never pull out. On set, Cagney became increasingly infamous for a hot temper that could ignite without warning. The New York Herald Tribune once reported that he clashed with an assistant director simply for being called a kid in a suit. One witness said his face went red and he charged in like a grenade with the pin already pulled. The next day, headlines spread everywhere, "Cagney's temper explodes." From that point on, the public began to believe that off-screen Cagney was just as violent and unstable as the gangsters he played. What most people didn't see was the insecurity simmering underneath those explosions. In 1937, a Hollywood tabloid leaked a rumor that Cagney had quietly looked into leg-lengthening surgery, an early brutal procedure where doctors would cut the bone and slowly stretch it, using a steel frame. The rumor was never confirmed, but it rooted itself instantly in the public imagination. The image of a mob boss who terrified audiences on screen, yet trembled before a measuring tape in real life, turned Cagney into a living contradiction. That contradiction was both destructive, and strangely, it became his brand. Instead of hiding, Cagney weaponized the weakness, pushing it into the foreground and converting it into pure force. He built the persona of a small bomb, a compact body strung tight like wire footsteps, rapid like the countdown to detonation, every sideways glance carrying a threat. Audiences stopped fixating on his height because they were pulled into something more visceral, the sense that at any second Cagney could erupt and tear apart everything in front of him. That intensity is exactly what allowed Cagney to break through the physical limitation Hollywood once treated as fatal. In 1999, the American Film Institute still ranked him among the top 10 greatest actors of all time, a late recognition for a man who spent his entire career fighting his own body. Cagney spread fear through violent bursts packed into a small frame. But in that same era, Hollywood witnessed another kind of threat, colder, heavier, and more controlled. No fists, no shouting. That man only had to stand still, stare straight through you, and speak with a voice like a blade to silence an entire room. That man was Edward G. Robinson. 7. Edward G. Robinson. Little Caesar and Hollywood's fear that audiences wouldn't believe a short boss. The first time audiences saw Edward G. Robinson on screen, the reaction often began with a split-second hesitation. He was short, thick-set, barely around 5'5", 1.65 mayors, with a stance that didn't match Hollywood's early 1930s blueprint of the towering, dominating male lead. But then Robinson leaned toward the camera, eyes locking in like a trap, and his voice came out compressed and razor-sharp. The theater went silent. Time observed at the time a small body but a gigantic fear. Hollywood didn't believe in that kind of magic. Warner Brothers listed Robinson as 5'9" in press materials, an inflated figure done deliberately. In Little Caesar 1931, the studio used the familiar toolkit. Low camera angles, raised chairs, taller co-stars ordered to hunch or sit, so Rico Bandello could always hold visual dominance. The reason was brutally simple. The executives in Warner boardrooms believed audiences would never accept a short gangster ruling the underworld. Ironically, the box office success of Little Caesar exposed the lie anyway. The film pulled in over $1.5 million during the Great Depression, numbers that made doubt look ridiculous. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times wrote bluntly, "Robinson doesn't need to be tall. His eyes and his voice make the whole room go quiet." The truth was that audiences didn't need height, they needed authority. And Robinson had it in a way that felt almost frighteningly natural. But Hollywood never let go of its body obsession. Even after proving himself, Robinson remained surrounded by silent staging, designed to keep the boss image from collapsing. He had to be twice as big as everyone else, not only on screen, but in real life. And that pressure grew heavier when politics began to seep into his career. In the early 1950s, Robinson was monitored by the FBI for his political views and his ties to left-leaning arts organizations. In 1952, he was called to testify before HUAC. The Washington Post ran a bitter headline, "Caesar on trial." On television, Robinson tried to explain that his stance was about artistic freedom, but public opinion was already ready to convict. The consequences came fast, and cold contracts were cut. Warner Brothers turned its back, leading roles vanished. From Hollywood's gangster king, Robinson slid into B-level supporting parts where fame could no longer protect him. Off-screen, Robinson was a completely different man. He owned a major art collection, Van Gogh, Cézanne, Picasso, worth over $3 million, covering the walls of his Beverly Hills home. He loved art, spoke gently, and avoided the violence the public projected onto him. Yet at Hollywood parties, the whispers still surfaced, if only he were a little taller. A close friend recalled that one drunken night, Robinson sighed. Just 10 more centimeters. And maybe I wouldn't have had to explain myself so much. Edward G. Robinson became Hollywood's perfect contradiction. The system was powerful enough to turn a short man into a terrifying legend, and ruthless enough to strip away every layer of protection the moment political winds shifted. He didn't fall because of talent. He fell because Hollywood never truly believed a small man could hold power forever. Golden Age Hollywood never truly hated short men. What it feared was the audience recognizing the truth. So it dug trenches, built platforms, bent camera angles, falsified press files, and when necessary, bent the human beings in front of the lens as well. Behind these non-standard bodies were compressed ambition, the terror of being looked down on, desperate resistance, and more often than not, quiet tragedy the spotlight never reaches. The legends you've just heard weren't measured only in talent. They were measured in centimeters their bodies were never allowed to have. And if you want to keep exposing the secrets Hollywood has tried to bury under studio floors for over a century, hit. Leave a comment and tell me which name do you want torn open next.